Good afternoon. On behalf of the Brazil Center at LLILAS, it's my pleasure to welcome you to our talk today by Professor Adele Nelson. Professor Nelson is Assistant Professor of Art History and Associate Director of the Center for Latin American Visual Studies at UT Austin. She specializes in post-war and contemporary art in Latin America with a focus on Brazil, and her writings have appeared internationally in Art Journal, Artologie, Art Margins, Modos, and various museum publications. Her new book, coming out in February, is Forming Abstraction, Art and Institutions in Post-War Brazil, part of the Studies on Latin American series from the University of California Press. Professor Nelson's research has been supported by the Fulbright U.S. Scholar Program, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the American Philosophical Society. So it's my pleasure to welcome today Professor Adele Nelson.
Thank you so much. I am very grateful to Seth and Paloma for the very kind invitation to speak today. I also want to more broadly, from my heart, thank LLILAS, BENSON, and the Brazil Center. I feel very fortunate to be part of this intellectually rich and wonderfully collegial community. It's been, you guys welcomed me right off the bat when I landed on UT's campus, and I'm so grateful to be part of it. Okay, so let me share my screen. Paloma, all look okay on your end?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm gonna give you a little bit of a kind of one through line in my book that is in physical existence next week. It got caught up in supply chain disruption, so it was supposed to come out in January. It's in the warehouses of University of Chicago Press next week. I mean, University of California Press, pardon me. Okay, in the decade following World War II, abstract artists in Brazil's cosmopolitan cities of Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo were celebrated as nonconformists who modeled engaged civil participation. Emergent white-collar middle-class men like Geraldo de Barros and affluent women like Lygia Clark were touted as public thinkers and their works of art as creative innovations. One of the objectives of my new book is to reveal the importance of exhibitory and pedagogical institutions and a vibrant art press in the development of abstract art in Brazil following World War II. The new museums and art institutions were inextricably entangled with the larger, expanding consumer culture, a confluence of art, shopping, tourism, and cultural diplomacy that historian Tony Bennett has coined the exhibitory complex. A photograph of a storefront display from 1955 in Rio de Janeiro showing mannequins in works of art displayed on easels captures the newfound embrace of abstract art in Brazil. But what at first seems like a straightforward scene is in fact layered with class, gendered, and racialized discourses that organize the reception of abstract art in Brazil. In this image, the connection between wealth, whiteness, and the consumption of abstract art is made clear. Smartly dressed white female mannequins donning pearls and gloves pose as both art admirers and objects of admiration themselves. Another larger aim of the book is to examine, via the lenses of art and institutions, the changing conceptions of social identities in Brazil following the country's return to democracy in 1945. I argue that artists, as well as art patrons and critics, were highly visible subjects and agents of a reimagining of Brazilian citizenship. These protagonists were, with few exceptions, privileged, educated, and white. The celebration of abstract art was not without tensions, and those eclipsed the abstraction figuration debates occurring in many places, including Brazil in the middle of the 20th century, in which the Communist Party promoted social realism and considered abstract art insufficient for political work and/or polluted with entanglements with capitalism. Self-taught artists, some Afro-descendant, were also elevated in the post-war cultural scene in Brazil, but as a subsidiary to abstraction, and as I'll discuss today, papering over racial inequities. What I'd like to do in my brief presentation today is to introduce and examine the exhibition and institutional context for modern and abstract art in Brazil in the 50s, and then consider a couple of the abstract art exhibitions and artists that I discuss in the book. As I do so, I will ask what politics informed the reception of abstract art and whose interests were served by these artists' proposals and productions. Using the changes in the work and self-presentation of the artists Geraldo de Barros and Lygia Clark as a through line. Abstract art developed out of a dynamic interplay of local and international conditions, forms, and discourses in an artistic milieu. I suggest in the book that that interplay was defined on one hand by elite deployment of soft power to establish a host of new modern art entities, and on the other hand, by reciprocal and at times contested relationships between artists and the new art institutions. The role of Latin American abstraction in the art and politics of the Cold War, I argue, is often misunderstood as a depoliticized formal enterprise or as a neo-colonial product. The case of Brazil reveals that the inadequacy of these shop-worn narratives that rely on binaries of national, international, political and apolitical, and left and right. Okay, so let me start off with some elucidation of the kind of institutional context and the political arena in which it functions. So the spectacle of Getúlio Vargas, former dictator turned democratically elected president, presiding over the award ceremony at the Second Bienal de São Paulo in December of 1953, illustrates the enormous shifts in the relationship between modern art and the state over the course of the middle of the 20th century in Brazil. During his 15-year rule from 1930 to 1945, inclusive of the quasi-fascist Estado Novo dictatorship, Vargas vastly expanded the federal government's role in culture, creating the Ministry of Education and Health. Living modern artists, with the notable exception of social realist Cândido Portinari, received limited state patronage. In World War II, including a second democratic Vargas administration from 51 to 54, so that's the moment this photograph is taken in, political and economic elites in Brazil utilized cultural diplomacy to project, the developing nation onto the world stage. The federal government dedicated substantial resources to modern art, notably the São Paulo Biennial, Brazil's most ambitious bid for relevance in the international cultural arena. And I'm showing you here the poster of the first Biennale in 1951 and an installation view of the second biennial in 53-54, which was an incredibly ambitious exhibition. It was basically like a temporary museum of modern art that included a retrospective of Pablo Picasso, Piet Mondrian, Henry Moore, many other artists, an exhibition dedicated to Cubism, Futurism. So a substantial amount of federal money was behind this endeavor. The federal government endorsed the Biennale's stated project of enrichment and internationalization of the local artistic scene, including, among young artists, the adoption of non-objective abstraction. A newsreel footage of the first Biennale in 1951 seems to confirm the worst fears of communist intellectuals and activists who argued that this new investment in private art institutions in the country sought to promote an art that marginalized the lives and rights of working class and poor people. This footage is from the Cinemateca Brasileiro, which, as some of you may know, under the Bolsonaro administration has been neglected to the point of mass firings of its staff and a subsequent fire that destroyed many of its archives. But what this newsreel footage shows us in 1951 is an overloaded truck, cars, and a Black woman dressed in the uniform of a domestic worker pass by the facade. Moments later, a smiling Darcy Vargas, the First Lady of Brazil, in a dark hat, seen here in the image in the center, accompanied by an entourage, ascends stairs and is greeted by a founding patron of the Biennale, Yolanda Pinedo, in white hat, also dressed in a smart suit. The men, including Cecilio Matarazzo, the institution of the Biennale's founder, largely remain at the margins, while the First Lady and elite women dutifully look at the prize-winning works at the first Biennale. Until the end, right here, where Matarazzo makes a cameo and engages with the First Lady. Modern art was without a doubt conceived as elite and the domain of the wealthy, but its prestige was also racialized and gendered. Here, white women of the Brazilian elite are represented as the consumers of art that has been announced as modern. That Yolanda Penedo, one of the women in the midst of that scene, was in fact a behind-the-scenes author of the Biennale, having traveled widely to secure the participation of foreign governments, was unacknowledged in this visualization of the habits of elite art viewing. Gender was utilized as a code to distinguish the serious from the unserious, as well as the producer from the consumer, a condition women artists like Lygia Clark would have to navigate in their works. So with that very brief introduction to the kind of institutions that are founded after World War II, modern art museums in both Rio and São Paulo, the Biennale, and also the MASP, Museum of Art in São Paulo, I want to think about how paying attention to social identities articulated and excluded in abstract art can impact our understanding of the artists and the groups they formed and their works. So first, I'd like to focus on what's considered the first abstract art group in Brazil, Grupo Rupture, the Rupture art group, and Geraldo de Barros, one of the most established artists in the group. Prior to the Rupture group's foundation in December of 1952, and I'm showing you their manifesto here, Barros had already exhibited extensively. In 1951, he had mounted one of the first exhibitions of non-objective abstract art in the country, and I'm showing you an installation view of that on the right. To the left are images of paintings of the two other artists who had the first non-objective abstract art exhibitions in Rio and São Paulo. So works of art that had no reference to nature at all and were composed of entirely non-representational images. In the book, I dedicate a chapter to thinking about the reconception of form among these Brazilian artists and aligned intellectuals in the late 40s and early 50s, establishing that dialogue between artists in these two cities were long established before the first abstract art groups were formed in the early 50s. Furthermore, as I'll discuss partially today, the conception of form that these artists began developing in the late 40s through the early 50s was emphatically multi and transmedia in its understanding. And that I argue in the book that their ideas around form underpinned the first definitions of what came to be called concrete art in Brazil. So Barros, the guy we're going to use as our through line for thinking about this moment in the 50s in Brazilian art and institutions, mounts this important photography exhibition in 51, and then in 1952, he mounts an exhibition dedicated to his multimedia print practice. He continued to craft technically innovative photograms, so cameraless photography, and went on, as we'll see in a second, to make paintings with industrial materials. Okay, so with that little bit of background about Barros, let's talk about the Rupture group. So on December 9, 1952, the Grupo Rupture exhibition opened at the Museum of Modern Art of São Paulo. Composed of 7 white men, all but 2 immigrants to Brazil from Southern and Central Europe, the group included established and emerging abstract artists and designers. The artists were from 2 generations. Their ages ranged from the late 20s to the early 40s and had a diverse fine art, applied art, and technical training, including engineering, drafting, printmaking, and photography. Native-born Geraldo de Barros, whose painting I'm showing you on the right, and Luis Saciloto, who I'm showing you on the left, came from contrasting locales in the state of São Paulo. So Barros was the child of an immigrant and a descendant of an old Brazilian family with Portuguese heritage, and spent his early childhood in the agricultural center of the state of São Paulo before moving with his family to the city. Sassilotto, on the other hand, was the son of Italian immigrants and came from the industrial so-called ABC region immediately south of the city of São Paulo, where he continued to live when he's participating in this group. Other artists in the group were from Italy, Austria, Hungary, and Poland. In paintings like this, Barros and Sassilotto crafted an abstraction that drew non-mimetically on the urban modern experience and technical systems, creating what they viewed as an easily read art intended to be accessible to all audiences. Waldemar Cordeiro, another member of the group, often considered its leader and a very prolific artist as well as art critic, coined the term form idea to describe Sassilotto and Barros's work, and more broadly, the ideal achieved when an artist activates non-objective abstraction grounded in color and compositional theory from European constructive avant-garde art with the lived systems of urban modernity. So in Sassilotto's case, he was drawing on his experience hand lettering the progenitor of IBM punch cards. He was trained as a draftsman and had a job, his day job was in these new industrialized industries within São Paulo. Whereas Barros his day job was working at the Banco do Brasil, and he uses and is drawing upon in the imagery of both his paintings and his photographs the punch cards that are being used at the Banco do Brasil, as well as the leftovers from the photography studio. So the photograph on the left is made up of used film that he's cut into a collage and made a photogram with. An item in a São Paulo daily newspaper while the exhibition was up utilizes the images of vapid female consumers of abstract art that we previously saw, I argue, in the reception of the first biennial. So this article on the exhibition is found in the social and domestic life section of the paper aimed at women. And the article recounts the reaction of 5 young society belles to the abstract art show. The reporter concludes, quote, "One cannot say that they understood much, well, but the objective of social life," the section of the newspaper, "focused them. A beautiful show of perfectly figurative art in the midst of the harmonized, colorful charades of the Rupture group," end quote. Photographs of each woman showed them posed in the exhibition space, contemplating the art or looking into the camera, while standing next to a work or two, such as Waldemar Cordeiro's optical development of the spiral of Archimedes. The women are cast as naive and unknowing viewers, and their supposed ignorance is played in the article for laughs. While they're uncertain of the merits of the displayed art, the extended photographic record of these young women's attendance of the Grupo Rupture exhibition and a section of the paper aimed at wealthy women demonstrates the cachet that abstract art held among the elite. Coincident with the sexist casting of the audiences for abstraction, a markedly different image of the producers of abstract art was circulating, the hardworking male striver. During the run of the Grupo Rupture exhibition, photographs of members of the group appeared in São Paulo newspapers, and I'm showing you just 2 of them here. On the right, we have the headline, "Rupture, the Artist's Fight," which clashes with the photographic image of fraternity of 4 members of the group. On the left, we see them at a cafe engaged in intellectual discourse. The presentation of the abstract artist in the media was a heteronormative European descendant masculine artist engaged in debate in public events and bars, and the Grupo Rupture members are ultimately portrayed as public thinkers, even civil leaders. What was also at play in these portrayals was the inclusion of Italian, Hungarian, and Polish immigrants of multiple class identities in an expanding definition of whiteness. The reception of Lygia Clark's solo show in Rio, on the other hand, just a month before in November of 1952, reveals a uniformly male rank of art critics reeling at how to try to assimilate a female abstract artist. So these are 2 works that Clark showed in her exhibition in Rio, which was actually at MEC in that building I showed you earlier, the Ministry of Health and Education. So, for example, eminent art critic Mário Pedrosa, whom Lygia Clark held in the highest esteem, had mainly positive things to say about her solo exhibition, but he had one complaint. quote, that her excessive refinement was her only feminine quality, end quote. In a remarkable account of another art critic's first studio visit with Clark, art critic Jaime Mauricio did not conceal his discomfort. Building suspense before admitting his error in judgment once he had viewed Clark's paintings, Mauricio commented at length on the artist's beauty, outfit, and mannerisms, punctuated by the realization at the end, quote, the girl was really a talent, end quote. Though cast as a confession, Mauricio narrates his difficulty in assimilating wealth, femininity, and motherhood with Clark's identity as an artist. The article also allows a reader to walk through their own dismissive assessment of Clark before acknowledging her art as a serious endeavor, and validates any lingering uneasiness on the reader's part. Other coverage of Clark's solo show included under the headline, "The Chick Stopped." So read the title of a 2-sentence assessment of Clark in early 1952 in a São Paulo art and design magazine, Habitat. The short notice quoted Clark's statement in Visão, which I'm showing you on the bottom, a national news magazine, that she had painted when she was young, but stopped painting for 8 years after she had her children, with no additional commentary save the title. It is possible that Habitat was criticizing Visão for foregrounding a professional woman's personal life. Nevertheless, the art and design magazine participated, like the wider press, in the bafflement of how to interpret an artist who was a woman and a mother. In the same issue of Habitat, members of Grupo Rupture are described as, quote, some youths enthusiastic for novelties, where their all-male ranks meant no contortions were necessary for their acceptance as avant-garde artists. Unmentioned in these takes on Clark was her multi-year study with a succession of artists in both Rio and Paris, including Fernand Léger, most notably, facts that were readily proffered by other art critics to indicate her prestige and requisite professionalization. Clark was by no means the only woman artist in abstract circles to receive praise in the immediate post-war art scene. However, her social class, as a descendant of a well-to-do family and the affluent wife of an engineer, and perceived youth, she was referred to as moça, and as a very young artist by art critics, troubled her assimilation into the description of women artists as industrious. And Clark herself was navigating these contradictory and sexist terms for the reception of art. So Clark herself begins very proactively self-fashioning herself in photographic portrayals and in the language she uses in lectures and in texts and interviews. So her self-fashioning in this photographic shoot, in her Rio studio in 1953 or 54, reveals the artist negotiating the accepted role of affluent women as consumers, not producers of abstract art. While Clark is surrounded by the markers of her profession, she also wears fashionable clothing, indistinguishable from those of the debutantes, fashion models, and film stars who posed as viewers of abstract art in the popular cultural imaginary, including her multi-hued skirt, which coordinated with the multi-hued facets of the array of paintings behind her. The photograph thus walks a line. Clark is envisioned as the ideal sophisticated art viewer and also as a protean maker. The overall scene in Clark's studio, replete with signifiers of class privilege, conjures creative and economic abundance. Clark developed her subsequent work, in which she used industrial materials and tools in concert with her becoming a kind of demi-celebrity in the cultural world of Rio, then the federal capital. So as she's exhibiting works and participating in abstract art groups, she's being interviewed about her professional status as a woman, being asked who she's voted for, being covered in the feminine press in terms of what she's wearing and things like that. So she's kind of a, not quite ever present, but she's a very frequent recurring figure in the media at the time. When asked in 1957 if art by women is distinct, Clark replied, quote, "No, art does not have a gender. It is a question of individual temperament to be more precious or monumental," end quote. She then explained her adoption of material of industrial paint and wood panels as a decidedly non-precious undertaking. Turning the noun pistola, or pistol, as in a spray gun used to spray paint cars, which is the tool she used to make these works, into a verb, she stated, quote, "I pistol modulated surface," which is the title that she gave to her series of work in the mid-50s. And then she went on to enumerate the various steps of her physical labor: cutting, sanding, assembling, and painting with the paint gun. In other words, Clark used her industrial working process to counter gender stereotypes. In a photograph that appeared in the feminine magazine of a daily Rio newspaper in '57, Clark is captured, automotive paint gun in hand, mask on her face, crouching over a work table, spraying paint onto a thin rectilinear support, presumably the same compressed wood panels that she used to make these works. Here is a woman pictured as modernist artist, pictured as skilled manual laborer, creating a flat, non-objective abstract surface. As much a masquerade as any self-presentation, Clark has traded underscoring her fine art training and wealth for metaphorically arming herself with the tools of industry in order to mount the assault on patriarchy she had announced in her writing and public lectures at the time. Okay, I want to shift now from thinking about Barros and Clark in terms of the gendered reception of abstraction and touching upon some elements of the theory that's driving their work, and think about the abstract group that Clark and other artists established in 1954 in Rio in order to further grasp the racialized discussion of abstraction in the middle of the 20th century. With its exhibition spanning exactly 2 years, from June of 1954 to June of 1956, Grupo Frente, or Front Group, produced collective displays in Rio and its surroundings during the turbulent period of the mid-50s, which saw the suicide of one president, Vargas, and the election of another, Juscelino Kubitschek, challenged by coup attempts. And members of Grupo Frente were very much kind of mobilized and factored into electoral politics in the mid-50s. They were frequently covered in the daily newspapers in Rio, including Tribuna da Imprensa, the newspaper run by Carlos Lacerda. And Clark, for example, went on record as supporting not Kubitschek, but another candidate for the 1955 election. So the group itself was very much being viewed politically and engaging in politics. The group was led by Rio artist and teacher Ivan Serpa, and supported, and I'm showing you a work by Serpa on the left, and supported by numerous critics, including Mário Pedrosa, and poets, including Ferreira Goulart. Grupo Frente consisted largely of Rio-based artists, including a significant number of Serpa's former students at his painting courses at the Museum of Modern Art in Rio, as well as more established artists like Lygia Clark and Abrim Palachanik, whose work I'm showing you an example of on the right, Lygia Pape, and others. And an important aspect of Grupo Frente and the way it functioned politically and artistically in the mid-50s is that it was seen as connected to these earlier debates about art and creativity in the late 40s. So I'm showing you an image on the left from the psychiatric hospital in Rio, referred to by the neighborhood that it is located in Engenho de Dentro, where some members of what would become Grupo Frente and Mário Pedrosa became fascinated by the work of psychiatric patients and saw it as a model for creativity. And at the same time, the art classes that Ivan Serpa was teaching at the Museum of Modern Art, centering the creativity of children, where his art classes were very experimental. So this kind of constellation of ideas of valorizing creativity outside of like a strict fine art training was very much the way that Grupo Frente was conceptualized and seen in the mid-50s. So the group went from 8 members to 15. It ultimately staged 4 different exhibitions. The members were from different places. The majority were not native to the Rio area. 3 were immigrants from Western Europe, and Palachinique had resettled in Brazil after growing up in Tel Aviv. The geographic diversity of the group, oh, sorry, lost my place in my slides. Oh, here we go. The geographic diversity of the group was largely that of middle-class mobility, with some members, including Carvão from the north and northeast, having moved to Rio, to the federal capital, in order to earn academic degrees, or Hélio Oiticica having spent a period of his childhood in Washington, D.C. when his father had a Guggenheim Fellowship. And although the majority of Grupo Frente artists practice abstraction and what they described as concrete abstraction, so these 2 works would be examples of that rigid geometric form of abstraction, the production of the participating artists was heterogeneous and extended to a so-called primitive artist, Elisa Martins da Silveira, as well as more painterly forms of abstraction. The group also displayed applied art, so furniture and jewelry in their exhibitions. The artists of Grupo Frente and critics writing in support of the group repeatedly underlined the group's stylistic diversity, despite the fact that on a numerical basis, geometric abstraction was absolutely predominant. In essays and interviews in the mid-50s, critics positioned Grupo Frente's agnostic approach to style as inherent to its innovation. Their rhetoric was taken up by the wider art press, where the group was described as being without a dogma and unified by the study of form, as well as their youth and camaraderie. The group's exhibitions and catalog designs highlighted the few figurative artists within a rubric that was defined by non-objective abstraction, broadly speaking, and concrete art in particular. The insistence on difference held together and constituting an ethos of an alterity that did not dissolve into eclecticism underpinned the theory of Grupo Frente. And it's on those grounds that the group was seen as modeling a kind of non-conformist ethical citizenship. The group organized, as I said, 4 shows, the biggest of which was at the Museum of Modern Art in Rio in 1955. And within this exhibition, they staged several pointed encounters where those disparate practices and identities held together in the group are centered. So one of those, which I know this is hard to see, but we have a lot of photographs of this exhibition, which is great, but it's not like every single corner is photographed head on. So this is the huge central gallery space, and this constellation of 3 works with the large painting by Serpa in the center and 2 paintings by Elisa Martins da Silveira on either side was on the sight line of the entrance to the museum. So when you walked in, you would see those 3 paint. I'm kind of trying to approximate with showing you this image of color works by the 2 artists. So this was, I suggest, kind of a concise announcement of the creative heterodoxy that the group espoused. So there's this large painting by Ivan Serpa, the leader of the group, centered between 2 paintings, half its size, by Martins da Silveira. Serpa's unfurling curvilinear forms, precisely rendered on a shifting rectilinear ground, contrasted with Martins' depiction of folkloric and popular mainstays of Brazilian everyday life. At the opposite end of the gallery, Serpa's 2 other large paintings flanked a sculpture. So again, you'll have to believe me that this is the installation of the works. You're seeing one of Serpa's paintings on the wall here. Here's the sculpture by Carvão, which I'm also showing you an image of. It's made up of matchboxes, this suspended sculpture that doesn't survive today. So we have these black and white photographs. The other side of the sculpture was another large painting by Serpa. So everywhere else in the show, on the walls, artists were shown monographically. So all of Lygia Clark's paintings were together, all of Lygia Pape's prints were together. But in the case of Serpa, his paintings are kind of distributed throughout the gallery and paired with his former students' work, so Martins and Carvão. So this decision to display Serpa's work alongside of those of his students, a woman and a man whose practices spanned so-called primitivist painting and non-objective abstraction, and who hailed from the Northeastern and Amazonian regions, signaled Serpa's leadership of the group and underscored the inclusivity of his pedagogy. This elevation of Serpa, who figured in the exhibition as the pioneering practitioner of concrete art with prolific painting production. The serial titles of the works that are displayed indicated that breadth. One of them is Pintura number 158, dovetailed with contemporary press portrayals of him, showing him as a carioca. He was born and raised from Rio, a Francophile. He taught French as well as children's art, as a benevolent cosmopolitan teacher. In other words, the vision of nonconformism that was espoused in the critical writing that surrounded Grupo Frente, which described their ethos of alterity as a form of nonconformism, of revolutionary practice as a creation of freedom, doesn't quite stand up to what happens in the exhibition. Instead, geographic and gender diversities and material experimentation are marshaled by the concretist grid. So here's Serpa on a piece of furniture by Polychenique in the show. Okay, so I want to conclude with talking a little bit more about Martins and what I feel like is at stake and her sort of inclusion in Grupo Frente, but also sort of bracketing off. So let me give you a little bit of background about Martins. So she was variously classified by critics as a naive, primitivist, or self-taught artist. She moved to Rio when she was already in her 30s from the Northeast and studied with Serpa and his adult painting class. She gained visibility. She won a prize in the second biennial and was described as an autodidact, so as a self-taught artist. However, and as a primitive artist. However, what I want to point to in closing is the extraordinary sort of inaccuracies and racial inequities that are papered over by the way that popular art was included into these massive displays at the biennial and centering of abstraction in these abstract art exhibitions that I've touched upon today, which is that to describe Martins as a self-taught artist who studied with Serpa, but not the concrete artist that she displayed with, is inaccurate. None of the rest of them studied at art academies either. So Oiticica and Carvão, the limit of their art education was also with Serpa. So why are they not autodidacts? Whereas the figurative artist who's focusing on popular painting is an autodidact. Another thing that I want to say in closing is the way in which these popular, or what they were called at the time, primitive painters, how they functioned in the art system in the middle of the 20th century in Rio. So as I mentioned, Martins won a prize at the second biennial, and the press announcements of her winning that prize illustrated the work by Hector dos Plazeres, a samba musician who was also an artist who had won a prize at the first biennial, an Afro-descendant man from Rio de Janeiro. And the press coverage of Martins' prize says Martin has substituted for Hector dos Plazeres. So the way in which popular art is functioning in this incredible silo where only one is allowed, and also in a way that really covered up racial inequities and differences. Okay. That's what I wanted to share for today. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you so much, Adele, for that wonderful talk. I would like to encourage the members of the audience to please pose your questions in chat, and I'll convey them to Adele. I thought maybe I could start the discussion. I'd like to just come back to the first slide you showed, the advertising. I'm kind of fascinated by that because I've been doing a little work on advertising myself in the 50s. So these very gendered and racialized images. And I wonder to what extent the modern artists, these abstract artists, are themselves involved in the advertising industry.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, very much so. So a lot of them had, like I mentioned, for a few of them, day jobs. They're functioning, and a number of them have applied art training. So they're working as poster designers, industrial designers, And the most kind of well-known case of that confluence of the abstract artist and graphic design and advertising is at the Sunday supplement of the Jornal do Brasil in the second half of the 50s into the 60s, which the Sunday supplement was kind of the key intellectual forum for abstract art debates, both concrete and then eventually neo-concrete ideas. And so that newspaper undergoes this massive graphic design overhaul that Amilcar de Castro, who's an important abstract sculptor, oversees. And one of the things that I've been thinking about lately with the Sunday supplement is that, so this is maybe in a different direction than your question, Seth, although I think it relates, which is that the Sunday supplement of the Jornal do Brasil was initially expanded in 56 and, kind of given resources by the publisher and targeted at women. So the overlap between the creation of a feminine press and the cultivation of women as consumers via advertising and via mass media is very tied up with the space that art coverage and cultural coverage gets to take in the newspaper. So that's just one example. There's other cases where like that image that I showed of Clark in the talk, that's in a feminine magazine within a daily newspaper in Rio. So there's a lot of overlap. And one of the things that's kind of that myself and other art historians of this moment have tried to think about is with Grupo Frente, one of the things that Mário Pedrosa, who's kind of, the like leading art critic of this moment, and he's a supporter and a theoretician of Grupo Frente and other artists and groups in the post-war moment in Brazil, but he talks about Grupo Frente as not only what I emphasized in the talk of this kind of model of nonconformist ethical citizenship, where you're not attached to ideology, it's instead this alterity is the word that I use to describe what he's proposing. But he also says around Grupo Frente that these innovative artists are going to be a model for industry. And that's kind of like, Mário Pedrosa, as with more knowledge than I do from the political historical point of view, was a seminal socialist political activist in Brazil after World War II. So he has this kind of seemingly kind of proto-capitalist statement that he makes around Grupo Frente, that this innovative experimental art, and one of the things that they display in the Grupo Frente show in 55 isn't just like jewelry and furniture and architectural maquettes, but they also show these material studies that they've done collectively, where they've like thought about different kinds of paper and like studied materials. He saw all of that as kind of a ground bed for industrial innovation. Anyhow, so that's some thoughts about, thank you for that question.
And I have a follow-up question since you're talking about industrial innovation. So I was also curious to know to what extent in the 50s we see the influence of these new technologies and industries in the creation of the art. I think a lot of you, when you talk about things, you mentioned some of them, but maybe if you could talk more broadly about that, I'd be interested in that.
Yeah. So they, the artists, so not all of them, some of them kind of like Waldemar Cordeiro is an interesting case because he starts, a lot of these artists adopt like the masonite, what we would call in the US masonite, these newfangled compressed wood panels as the support for their paintings, which were very cheap, but were also, there's Eucatex, which was made out of eucalyptus and other native made wood panels that a lot of the abstract artists were adopting because they were cheap, because they were tied to industry. So they weren't like fine art, kind of, older materials. They had like a cachet of the new, and also because they had a very planar surface, which is what they wanted, as a very flat surface. And then they were using industrial paints, they basically, car paints, cheap, industrial paints. And what I talk about in the book is so one of the ways that this moment in Brazilian art and in the relationship between industry and abstract art has been understood is that the abstract artists were kind of like hand in glove with the industrialization after World War II, that they were bolsters of it, that they became a face of it to some degree domestically and internationally. Brasilia would be maybe like the extreme version of that, right? These aesthetics become a postcard for ultra modern Brazil. But what I try to do in the book is to complicate that, because I don't think that like a lot of these artists are adopting industrial materials. Some of them are using both fine art and industrial materials. They're sort of hybrids. So Waldemar Cordeiro is using like those compressed wood panels, but then he's using tempera, like a very old paint on top of those new panels. But what I think, like Geraldo de Barros, that photograph that's on the flyer for the talk today, and the circles where he's using kind of the leftovers from the dark room, leftovers of photographs, and then he's using punch cards to make some of these photograms. And Ivan Serpa is using like technologies for book conservation. But what they do in those works, and maybe I'll show these images because it's more effective than me verbally describing them. So here's an Ivan Serpa collage using, he's using, he works, his day job is at the Biblioteca Nacional, and he's doing book conservation. And so he's using like the compression and glues and heat treated papers that they're using to repair books. What I think in terms of these artists' relationship to technology is they definitely are, and Clark with the paint gun, like she's kind of taking on the mantle of like the industrial worker, but a lot of them are kind of compressing old and new technologies, and it's not techno like philia. They're not celebrating the technology without some criticism and some feedback loop. That's my opinion, is that what they're like they're thinking through the new technologies that are surrounding them in industrializing city like São Paulo. That's a lot of them are using as like part of their day jobs, but they aren't like a celebration. There's critique in how they're handling those new industrial materials.
Thank you. Yeah, we have a question from the audience from Nicole Smith Johnson. She writes, thanks so much for this talk, Adele. So great to get more insight into your work. I'm curious about how you developed your, to my mind, unique perspective on this period of Brazilian art history. How do you situate your work within other scholarship on this period? What thinkers, scholars, narratives are you responding to and maybe challenging?
Thanks, Nicole. Thank you for watching, and thank you for your question. Yeah, well, there is a huge amount of excellent scholarship about this moment in Brazil. So I am building on like Geraldo de Barros, a colleague and good friend of mine, Eloisa Espada, who's at the Instituto Morelos Salles. Her work has been essential to my understanding of him and his processes. So the thing that I say in the introduction to my book, which is how I feel about it, but I'm just telling you, I'm giving you the kind of like compressed version of it, which is that, so there's been a large amount of attention, and as some of you know, US and European museums are collecting the art of this period from Brazil in great depth and have for a bit. But we are all building on the shoulders of Brazilian scholars, who are the ones who first turned the attention to the Biennial and these modern art institutions, and tried to think through what role they were playing in the changing dynamics. So Aracy Amaral, who's a founding art historian in Brazil, her work is very important and is a through line for me in the book. And then I'm also trying to think like the thing that from the dissertation to the book came to the fore was particularly for me thinking about gender and relationship to the dynamics that I was tracing. And yeah, and then there's lots of other people. So, but I hear from Paloma that there's other questions. So maybe Nicole, I'm sorry, that was an insufficient answer, but it's starting to answer it. Maybe I'll come back to it if we run out of questions.
Paloma.
Yeah, I have a question. Is Brazilian art unique in Latin America and can be easily distinguished from the abstract art of other countries in Latin America? Did you hear, Adele?
I didn't, sorry that it got unstable for a minute, but now it's back. What'd you say, Paloma?
If this art can be easily distinguished from the abstract art in other countries in Latin America?
Yeah, so that's a complex question. So one colleague whose scholarship I am building on in the book is a Argentine art historian, Maria Amalia Garcia, who wrote a very important book that was translated into the series that my book's part of at University of California Press. Her book was the first book in the series, where she traces the connections, the dialogues, and the exchange between Argentine and Brazilian abstract artists in the 40s and 50s. One of the conditions of art history writ large as a discipline, and I don't, this isn't unique to art history, but is that the nation state very much determines how we study things. And so we have, like, the histories for a while were very nation focused and less about, and then in the last 20 years, there have been a lot of exhibitions that have tried to think across national contexts. So the Cisnetos Collection, which is now at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, is a collection that collects Argentine, Venezuelan, Brazilian art from, as well as a few other nations, but those are the ones in the greatest concentration. And the exhibitions of that collection has tried to think through what are the formal and conceptual actual, historical exchanges between these groups. The short answer, Paloma, is that there's a lot of exchange. So those are like Maria Amalia does a lot of deep digging to establish the exchanges, the intercultural exchanges is what she calls them, between, or the interregional exchanges, pardon me, between Rio and São Paulo and Buenos Aires. But of course, there are specific debates too that are happening that are unique to each of the situations. But these artists, part of the choice to be abstract is a choice to want to participate in non-nationally framed conversations. So they're choosing abstraction in order to, just as a choice of figuration does this as well, but they're trying to insert themselves in certain histories, genealogies of art. So for them, that's like the historical European avant-gardes that were constructivist in orientation, and they see themselves in dialogue with contemporary artists and within Latin America and in Europe and the United States as they're creating those works. Yeah, and like there's a figure, a Swiss artist and designer, Max Bill, who's the one who's like the promoter of this term of concrete art in the middle of the 20th century in the post-war moment. And he's organizing big shows of concrete art in Europe that are artists from all across the Americas and Europe that he's like uniting under this, at that point, quite broad banner. So that's just like some, and I see there's another question. Yeah.
From Gina McDaniel Tarver. Thank you, Adele. Was there use of new technological materials and techniques aligned with the idea of industrial worker skill or engineering skill, similar to the Russian constructivists? You touched on that a bit, maybe with the photo of Clark working.
Yeah, thanks, Gina, and thank you for tuning in. So, so it's complex. So they're definitely, I agree with you that Clark image is very much riffing on like, artist as productive member of society, as a productivist constructor, and the artists in Grupo Frente like Oiticica and Serpa at a certain point and Carvão are using the term construction as titles of their work. And Oiticica writes about that he sees himself as a researcher, and a researcher is a constructor. So they definitely are using those metaphors. But I think that in the art historian, like the images, maybe I'll show you this image to make this point, which is that the conclusion of the book looks at the National Exhibition of Concrete Art in 1956 in São Paulo, in 1957 in Rio, which is, this often written about exhibition. It's a moment of like unity between the abstract artists in Rio and São Paulo that then fractures into polemics. And there's much more to say about that, some of which, Gina, just as well as me. But one of the things, what I say about this exhibition in the conclusion of the book is that part of what these artists are doing in this exhibition, it is this attempted moment of unity between concrete artists and poets between the two cities. But they're also trying to position themselves in a less technocratic way. So the writing that surrounds this exhibition by Waldemar Cordeiro, by Pedrosa, by other thinkers, is that they're cautioning architects about the way that they're beginning to be talked about in Brazilian society as constructors, as the privileged sort of makers of a new Brazilian society, as engineers, essentially, of a new Brazilian nation. And the poets and artists and art critics say, like, architects need to be very careful. Their relationship with visual art is how they access creativity. Visual artists, we don't want to be seen as technocrats. And so one of the things that I find has always like confused me about the National Exhibition of Concrete Art is that, like Seth's question at the beginning pointed to, the vast majority of these artists are designers, some of them with day jobs, some of them doing it as a side gig. Cordeiro is a landscape architect. Lygia Clark is actually at this time has very ambitious architectural collaborations that she's hoping to do stuff with the Niemeyer building and all this stuff. A lot of them are industrial designers, et cetera, graphic designers, all that. The exhibition has no applied art in it. It is only paintings, sculptures, works on paper, and poetry. And I think that was they were throwing down the gauntlet to try to put the brakes on some of the very developmentalist technocratic language that was being used to talk about modernist architecture and abstract art at the time. But they're trying to distinguish what they're doing from in service of industry in some kind of one-to-one way.
We have a question from Paloma. In general, support from the state for the arts in Latin America is not or has not been abundant. Would you say that abstract art is less supported by the state than other types of visual art, and if so, why?
Well, what I and this isn't me alone, but what I say in the book is that actually, in the post-World War II moment, and this isn't unique to Brazil, culture is seen as a really key, a privileged conduit for how Brazil crafts itself as sort of an emerging global power. So Brazil, following World War II, its ambitions were sort of endless. It thought it was going to get a seat on the Security Council at the UN. It was very strategic about, Vargas was very strategic during World War II of extracting as much economic funds from the US and Britain as he could. And so they do invest in culture, and the Biennial being kind of the case in point of that. So the Biennial was a private institution run out of the Museum of Modern Art in São Paulo with Cecilio Matarazzo, this industrialist, as its patron. He contributed to its funding, absolutely. He solicited money from other private sources, but the invitations for the Biennial went out through the state department. They went through embassies. There was a lot of federal and state and city money that made that exhibition possible. So this was a moment of very heavy public funding of the visual arts and of abstract art, because that's what the Biennial in part celebrated, so indirectly of abstract art.
Thank you. Carolina Barmel has a question. Dear Adele, thanks for the lecture. What could you tell us about the lyric, abstraction, non-geometrical from Brazil at the same time?
Yeah, thanks, Carolina. So I have lots of colleagues who've written more about this than me, like Ana Franco and Mariola Alvarez did a edited volume thinking about kind of other histories of abstraction in Latin America. Lyrical abstraction or gestural abstraction is understudied in Latin America as a whole, although there are some exceptions and some excellent work. But what I talk about it some in the book. Some of these early exhibitions of abstraction bridged gestural and geometric abstraction. Antonio Bandeira is a figure who, an artist originally from Ceará, who's very, very prominent and in abstract circles in Rio in the early 50s. There are printmakers who are training alongside of an artist like Lygia Pape, whose work is gestural. So the early exhibitions of abstract art, and I'm thinking of the National Exhibition of Abstract Art in Petrópolis in 1953 while I'm talking now, included both lyrical and geometric abstraction. Part of the over visibility of geometric abstraction in our histories of Brazilian art and in Latin American post-war art writ large. There are complex reasons for this, but one of them is that there was a much greater critical apparatus supporting geometric abstraction. And so the work was being theorized and sort of groups were forming, and there was a visibility spaces like the Sunday supplement of the Jornal do Brasil, where abstract, geometric abstract or concrete art debates are happening, and there's an overlap with poetry that, so lyrical abstraction or gestural abstraction gets more visibility from Brazilian art institutions as the 50s unfold, and in the biennials in the 60s, it's quite central, but that needs a lot more scholarship than there has been thus far.
I'd like to follow up on a response you gave earlier to, I think, Paloma's question about how the artists saw themselves as part of a continental global community of artists. So I was wondering if you could talk a little about the way in which these Brazilian artists are received in the global North, during their lifetime. I know you mentioned that there's been like a boom and interest, and I think Lygia Clark had her own exhibit at MoMA in the last 10 years or so. But can you talk a little bit about those sort of the global division of labor in the art world and how that functioned during their lifetime?
Yeah, absolutely. So, so there has been this posthumous, like, laudatory reception of these artists beginning in the early 90s with exhibitions in Europe and recent monographic shows of Clark and Oiticica and Pape. Those are the three that have received the most visibility in the global North. But during their lifetime, so in the early moment that I study, the artist visibility in the global North is primarily through the exhibitions that are being organized by Brazilian institutions. So it's like at the biennial, when foreign critics come to the biennial, when foreign art critics cover the biennial in foreign press, and also the Museum of Modern Art in São Paulo initially, and then the Museum of Modern Art in Rio, even more robustly in partnership with the foreign ministry of the federal government in Brazil, begin sending exhibitions abroad. So there's like a exhibition that tours all of South America of Brazilian modern art, where these abstract artists are the centered figures. And there's an exhibition in Paris in 55, there's an exhibition in 57. So it's mainly Brazilian institutions sending kind of overviews of Brazilian art. There were printmaking shows also were circulating. Those were a lot cheaper, so a lot of prints were circulating. But in terms of like the commercial art gallery scene in Brazil is emerging at the same time as this private museum infrastructure is booming. And some artists like Lygia Clark had like a kind of established market already in the 60s, but it's very, it's nothing like we think of an art market today. And so in the 50s, it's kind of export art via these big art institutions as their visibility in the global North. Although many of them had, exchanges with intellectuals abroad, letter writing, they were reading journals, Brazilian periodicals were circulating. But in the 60s, a number of them are in, self-exile during the dictatorship in Europe or the United States. So Clark is in Paris for a long period of time, Oiticica is in London, and then in New York for close to a decade, under a decade. So then they have, a different relationship at that point. But it's a good question, Seth. That's my kind of view on it, that in the 50s, it's more like the museums of modern art and the biennial are controlling the way that their work is being, having any visibility outside of Brazil.
Well, Adele, I wanted to thank you for that wonderful talk. I also wanted to congratulate you on the publication of your book. We're all very happy for you and excited to read it. I want to thank the audience for coming here today. I'll just let you know that at March, the end of March, Adele actually is helping the Brazil Center to organize a special event to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the Semana de Arte Moderna. So stay tuned for those announcements. We'll have an art historian and a literary critic. So we're looking forward to that event. And once more, again, Adele, thank you so much for sharing your scholarship with us. And have a good afternoon, everybody.
Thank you so much for coming. Bye, everyone. Thank you, Seth and Paloma.